All right, welcome back. So, in this section, what we're going to do is take a look at service principles within Databricks. And whenever you're building out a service principle, one thing you really need to think about is what are the services that these principles will be managing for you. So, in my case, I've got the four workspaces. So, I've got my hub and then dev, QA, and prod. And I'm also going to be interacting with Power BI. And so, there's the ability, I think, to create Databricks managed service principles. And there's also a way to do it through Active Directory. And I'm going to take the Active Directory approach or the Microsoft Entra approach. And so what I'll do is I'll create a list of service principles in Microsoft Entra, and then I will put those into an Active Directory group and then add that Active Directory group to Power BI. And so that way these principles can work with Power BI. And the goal will be for my dev, QA, and prod principles to manage dev, QA, and prod workspaces. On the flip side, for Databricks, I'll take those same principles and I will add them to Databricks. And I've got a hub, so they'll all be added to my hub. And then I will also add kind of one to one, basically my dev principle to my dev workspace, my QA principle, and prod principles to their respective workspaces as well. And then within those workspaces, they should only have access to the dev at their specified level. So something else to think about is not just kind of the access, but also the cost. So this kind of helps me determine how I want these to access different resources. So again, if you recall, I am using, at least in my setup, the hub workspace will be kind of treated as my centralized data engineering workspace. The other workspaces are going to be more, even though they say, dev, QA, and prod, those will be aligned with dev, QA, and prod data. However, I can access all of that data, so dev, QA, and prod. I can access those catalogs all from this centralized workspace. So kind of why am I overcomplicating some of these things? Well, you can think about it like this. The engineering work will occur within this hub, but then you might have other teams that are associated with one of these different environments. So this way, what I can do is say, well, hey, like this, for this demo, I think it makes sense to have the dev workspace, the QA, and the prod workspace. But this just as easily could be the finance workspace, the data scientist workspace, and I don't know, the risk analyst workspace. So you could have three different workspaces, and then each one of those workspaces only has access to their own specific catalogs. What I'm doing is also keeping my primary engineering workspace running as well. And so within each one of those workspaces, you'll have your own compute. So if I'm doing general ETL tasks that will load up from, from my catalogs, if my goal is to take the data from these catalogs and load it into these respective workspaces, it might be easy enough just to leverage the one compute resource in my hub and then allow those service principals to have access to their respective data. So this is kind of the approach that I'll take is my ETL will go through the hub and use the compute resources here to load up the data for these three different environments. So with that said, let's kind of hop over to the Visual Studio code and take a look at what we're going to need here. So what I'm going to build out is a series of service principles. So these are my Microsoft Entra principles. And the way that I've got my code laid out right now is for anything that is Microsoft Entra related, I'll be going through one of my plans. So specifically, I'll be going through my user.management plan. And this way, what I can do is I can create an Azure application. It's an application registration is what it's called in Azure. And it's kind of like a base for service principles. So I'll create this service principle. I'm just going to call it SVC for service underscore data because this is not really a Databricks thing, not really a Power BI thing. It's just going to work with my data related tasks. And then I'm going to give it a suffix of the environment. So dev, QA, or prod. So I'm creating this app registration. Next up, I'm going to create a service principle that is essentially going to be tied to the client ID of that application that I just created. So what I'm doing is basically taking that application and turning it into a principle, turning it into a service principle. And that could be it. That could be all you need. But what I want to do is I want to use these for automating tasks within Power BI. So in order to do that, if I go to this section, so in order to automate my tasks within Power BI for these workspaces, I'll need a tenant ID, a client ID, and a client secret. So for that client secret, what I'll do is I will create an Azure Service Principal password. And for that password, I'm just going to, well, I should say for that password, I will link it back to the Service Principal ID that I just created in the previous step. So at that point, I should have my principal or my application turned into a principal and then add a secret on top of that. Next up, what we'll do is we actually want to be able to save this. So I'll be referencing my key vault that I already have imported before and created. So I'm going to use my data block to reference that key vault. And so what I'll do is I'll create a secret for the actual secret itself for the password. I will pass the value that I just got from creating that service principal. And I'm also going to create another secret, this time for the specifically for the client ID. So what I'll be doing is grabbing the value, which is just the client ID that is associated with that application registration. And so that way what I can do is when I make my call to the Power BI API in the future, I'll have my tenant ID, which my tenant ID, of course, will be the same for everything within my tenant. But then I'll have my unique client ID and my unique secret. So that gives me everything I need for making the API calls. In order to actually have permissions within Power BI, I'll need to have those service principals within a group. And so I'm going to create an Azure Active Directory group called Power BI Service Principals. And then what I'll do is I will add each one of those service principals, where I'll just grab the object ID. And I don't need this piece anymore. I'll just grab the object ID and I will put those into that group. Of course, to complicate things a bit more, I'm doing this in one pass. So I'm creating this variable which maps objects. And so I'll just call these objects this env for this environment. And so what I'll do is I'll kind of loop through dev, QA, and prod. And if you've seen some of my code before, what I typically was doing was I would have this kind of configuration block that I would reference. And this time, instead of doing a configuration block or a JSON file off to the side, I'm just kind of filling it up here within the file so that it's easier to see. So my environments might vary from a specific, one-off environment to these three environments, but I could also include hub or test or whatever. So I figured instead of kind of like fully centralizing it, I would just bring that section of the code in here. This brings me to another point, which is why am I using mapped objects as my variable instead of doing just like a list of strings? Your list of strings could work, and it might be a little bit simpler for your first few objects. So like, let's say this object right here, if I do a for each, then what I would just do is I would just kind of grab each item in that list and I'd be good to go. But what happens if I were to decide to remove this, or heck, even just put it in a different order? Well, then what that does is that would change the index of each of these items. So that would cause a destroy and then rebuild of the various items that I've just created, which I don't want. I'd much rather lean on this key value pairing. So that way I can add items to the list or take them away. And as long as the key and value still are available, then my resources will remain unchanged, which is what I want. So that is just about everything for this first section. So what we're going to do is just go ahead and create the Azure AD side of the service principals. So I'll just run a Terraform apply. And what I'm going to do is while I run this apply, I'm going to pause the video so you don't see any of my sensitive data. All right, we're back. So my 3 service principals created successfully. And then with those, they also have secrets that have been created and added to the key vault as well. And all of those service principals have been added to my new Active Directory group. All right, so the next up on our list of things to do is, let's go ahead and we'll save everything. So just want to make sure that did save, in fact. So that's where I want it to be. All right, so my Active Directory service principals, those are good. Next up, we want to move on over to the hub. So for my hub, what I'll do is I'm going to bring in my service principals file. And for this one, we're going to take a similar approach. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of iterate through dev, QA, and prod. And one of the first things that I need to do is grab my Azure AD applications that I just created. So I just created 3 apps. So what I'm going to do now is just identify those by name. And I'm going to just kind of iterate through this for each block. And I'm going to grab each of those principles for dev, QA, and prod. Next up, I'm just going to create a simple Databricks service principle. Again, iterating through that same list. This time, I need to pass the application ID. So what I'll do is I'll just pass my, it's my data.application, and then the name of it, and then I'm going to pass each key of it, and then the actual client ID itself. I'm going to go ahead and give it a display name. So I'm going to try to match the display name of kind of what I did in the previous section. And then what I'll do is I will grant these Databricks service principals access to the hub workspace as administrators. So let's move on over to that section. So if I cd back one, cd unity, I think it's cd unity catalog, and then I should have an ls here, and I'm going to cd into my hub. And now I'll just run a Terraform apply. So one thing that I want to point out here is the blast radius. So I've talked to you about this before, and this is where, again, it becomes really important that you're separating out. You don't have to, but really it's super beneficial to go ahead and separate out your Entra related items from your Databricks items. And there's going to be another step too that follows this, where I bring in the catalogs also. So what I'm really making sure to do is, at least kind of at this account level, let's go ahead and just say yes to this. I really want to make Databricks aware of these service principles. So I'm not really worried about Unity catalog at this point, but I am bringing in my Entra service principles into Databricks. If you tried to do all this in one step, you're going to run into some API issues, and this is where kind of that statefulness of Terraform is super annoying. Just clear this out. So when I say the statefulness of Terraform is annoying, what I mean is, let's just actually hop back down 1 second into my dev environment, and then we'll just bring in the 2 pieces here, and I'll talk about that annoyance here in just a minute. All right, so I'm going to go to my spoke this time. So what I'm doing is, like I told you, I'm switching into my dev environment, and then my dev, QA, and prod, those go to my dev, QA, and prod spokes. And so what I'll bring in will be my the workspace section, and then also the catalog service principal section. So on the workspace side of things, what we'll do is it's kind of we've got a couple prereqs here. So the first part is, again, grab that Azure application by name. So I'm going to I'll use a data block for that. And then the next thing that I'll do is I will grab the service principal that I just created. This time I have to pass an application ID to it. So I've got some notes up here. Basically, I couldn't really skip these sections even though I wanted to. So, I thought, well, I just need that application ID. Maybe I can grab this. Didn't work. Maybe I can just grab this by name. That didn't work. So it's kind of a 2-part step here. Two prerequisite steps. And what I'm doing is I'm just adding each service principal to their respective Databricks workspace. So in this case, what I'm doing is just grabbing this workspace ID, which in this case will be dev. The service principal is what I'm grabbing here. So at this point, I'm no longer iterating through dev, QA, and prod with the loop. Instead, what I'm doing is going with this with kind of like the module approach, where each dev, QA, and prod plan points to this. So figure I'd take a break for a second. So yeah, I'm getting ready to bring these in. That's the service principal part. And then next up is, I say next up, but kind of at the same time, what I'm doing is as those items are coming in, I've got this depends on block where I'm saying, well, hey, I want to make sure that I have the catalog section is done. There's been workspace binding, which that's already occurred. And then the other thing is making sure that this specific Databricks managed workspace permission assignment has taken place. And at that point, what I'm doing is basically bringing in my service principals into Databricks. And then I am granting them pretty much all privileges for a given workspace, or for a given catalog within a workspace. So I'm going to go ahead and just run Terraform apply and let this go for a second. And so while this is going, what I wanted to point out was this piece right here is going to be a huge nuisance if you try to do this before the Entra IDs have been brought into Databricks in general. So what I mean by that is at the workspace level, it's not as big of a deal. But at the account level for Databricks, I had to go ahead and bring these Entra IDs into the account. And so now what I'm doing is, now that they at least exist in the account somewhere, I'm kind of doing two things at once. I am bringing those into a given workspace, and I am allowing that principal to have access to a catalog. So now that I'm allowing it to have access to a catalog, what that means is that these service principals, they should in theory be able to enter my workspace, use a compute resource, and then work with their respective data. And so what that looks like is, and if I step back over here again, I wanted to point out the permissions level on this was admin. So on the Power BI side of things, what I did was I created an Active Directory group and then added the principals to that. And so what I would effectively be doing is adding that Active Directory group to Power BI as an administrative unit. Whereas in Databricks, they actually have two default user groups, admins and users. So if I wanted to, I could kind of take this thing to the next level and then add these service principals to another group within Databricks. But when they're getting access, when they're first getting access to a workspace, they're already going to go into a default group, and in this case, they're going to be admins anyways. So just a little bit of something, a little bit about what's going on there. So let's see. I think that covers pretty much everything here. We've got. I need to go down to my different environments. So if I go to QA, I'll just run a Terraform apply, and then I'll need to do the same thing for prod as well. But I mean, at that point, we'll have our Entra groups that have been created, and then they've been added to an Active Directory group that can be added to Power BI as admins. And then we'll have our Databricks principals, and those principals have been added to the account, which I did that through the hub code. And then they're being added to each individual workspace. And then within each workspace, I'm also granting them access kind of at the spoke level to their respective catalogs. So these next two steps are just going to be kind of repeating the same thing, which is prepping the QA section, which we're doing right now, and then the next piece would just be running through the same exact thing again for prod. So I'm not going to waste your time with taking a look at that. I'm just going to switch directories, run apply on prod, and then should be good to go. So with that said, I think in the next video we'll take a look at actually like setting up some of the tokens that we'll need for making authentication into the APIs. So that's it for right now. I'll catch you in the next video.